Good afternoon and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center, where quite suddenly on a late Friday, we are going to have what we see as a very necessary discussion of a fascinating and difficult subject, which is the life and work of Henry Kissinger, who died on Wednesday at the age of 100. He would no doubt be gratified by the amount of ink that has already been spilled in memoriam just over the past 48 hours. He's somebody who was written about a great deal in his lifetime, and he will doubtless be written about in decades and perhaps even centuries to come, one of the few people from the current era of whom that could be said. We are honored to have with us today two men who knew him well and who worked closely with Dr. Kissinger over the decades. Ambassador Winston Lord, who began his work with Dr. Kissinger from 1970 to 1973, when he was a special assistant to the then National Security Advisor. Ambassador Lord was then director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and from 1985 to 1989 served as American ambassador in Beijing, where I had the pleasure of serving with him. Subsequently, he was Assistant Secretary of State from 1993 to 1997. A few years ago, some of you may have attended a launch we did here at the Wilson Center for Ambassador Lord's book, Kissinger on Kissinger, Reflections on Diplomacy, Grand Strategy, and Leadership. Perhaps we'll draw on some of those lessons today. We're also joined by a guest who is very familiar to all of our listeners and who I'm sorry to say is now a guest of the Wilson Center rather than in the office next to mine, Ambassador J. Stapleton Roy. He was ambassador to China from 1991 to 1995, having previously served as our ambassador to Singapore, and subsequently he was our ambassador to Indonesia. He achieved the rank of career ambassador, the highest rank in the Foreign Service, in 1996. At the end of his career in state, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research from 1999 until 2000. He then went and worked with Kissinger Associates, Dr. Kissinger's consulting arm in New York City, where he was obviously very close to Dr. Kissinger and all he did. He then came here to the Wilson Center, where he was the founding director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and where I had the pleasure to work with him for about 8 years. Welcome to both of you. I know that you've both been called on constantly since we got the news Wednesday night, but it's a pleasure to have you both back with us at Wilson. I wanted to begin by asking both of you what your personal experience of working with Dr. Kissinger was. What did you do with him? What did you observe? And I know that both of you were involved with him at different phases of your careers, and you saw some of his thinking about China evolve. But if we could begin with the first time you worked with him and what you drew from that experience, maybe beginning with you, Ambassador Lord, and then Stape.
Thank you, Bob. First, a grace note. I genuinely appreciate you and the Institute hosting this occasion, because there's a lot of ink have been spilled on Henry, and that'll continue. But a lot of it's distorting and even vicious, and it's nice to have at least an objective discussion we can have about this great man and close friend. I'm also pleased to be on this forum with Stape Roy. We've served together, and we each had a mini crisis in our career, and in each case, we supported the other. So it's a personal pleasure to be with him as well. Working with Henry, what it's like, we're going to have to chop that up into several questions and answers, I think, because I don't want to give you a 45-minute treatise right now. I can save time for Stape. I first met him, and it had an impression on me, and it lasted. In 1969, I had been in the Pentagon. I went over, was interviewed by him for a job in the NSC. And what basically came through in a rather hectic 15-minute meeting was he wanted someone who would give him candid advice, as long as it was argued with rigor and not mushiness. And he would listen to it, but if he disagreed, he expected it to be carried out loyally. So this matched his philosophy and mine. I do believe that if and you're in service, you should debate issues. If you lose the debate and it's of sufficient moral and ethical depth, then you can leave. But if not, you stay loyally, fight another day, and carry out the policy loyally. So this indicated to me from the very beginning that he wanted candid advice, unlike many strong men who sort of push this aside. And finally, I'll illustrate this by saying my first year was spent actually sending him memos, sort of like a mini policy planning staff, the devil's advocate, questioning, raising issues for the future, many of which dissented from current policy. A year later, he hired me specifically because of those memos, sometimes disagreeing, not in spite of them. So this is my initial impression, and it carried through my 8 years of service with him.
And if I could ask a follow-up, because in some of the writing about Dr. Kissinger, there are stories of his having a kind of Vesuvian temper. He asks for long hours, a lot of hard work. He could sometimes be hard on colleagues and subordinates. And yet I've known many people who went through that kind of work style with him, including the two of you, who remained extremely loyal over the years. And so there is clearly something else in him, as a boss and as a colleague, that inspired that kind of loyalty. Is there anything along those lines that you can tell us?
Yes. First of all, if I had to sum up my experience with him, I would have started by saying the agony and the ecstasy. He was tough. We had incredible hours, but he worked even longer hours. But he demanded excellence. And in the course of doing that, he often would reject drafts and criticize what you were doing. So he stretched my nerves, he stretched my patience, but he also stretched my skills and my horizons. And so intellectually, I developed greatly under him, and I'll always be grateful for that. So yes, he was a tough boss, but he exuded excellence, he demonstrated it, and he got it out of you. And therefore, it was certainly an experience that I'll always cherish.
How about you, Stape? When did you first come in contact with Dr. Kissinger? What was that like?
My contact with Dr. Kissinger can really be broken into three sectors. My first exposures to him were as a mid-level officer in the State Department, where I dealt with him essentially as a superior far above me, and he didn't know who I was, or if he did, I was doing something wrong. My second exposures to him were when I was the American ambassador in Beijing. And he would come annually with a group of very high-powered business leaders and former government officials. And I would give briefings for them at the residence. And these would be long, substantive discussions extending over 2 or 3 hours. That was the first time that I had a chance intellectually to engage with Dr. Kissinger. I did not in the first iterations. Then, when I joined Dr. Kissinger's consulting firm, and later as the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, I either worked with him on a daily basis or had frequent contact with him over the last 23 years, really. So I would break into that. My first exposure to him was I was the second secretary in Moscow embassy during President Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972. Wynn was along at that time, but he of course, was an exalted senior official working with Dr. Kissinger. And I was a part of a courier service. The White House group was staying in the Kremlin, whereas the Secretary of State was banished off to a hotel. And we had a courier service of running classified messages from the embassy over to the Kremlin and then bringing them back. And I was returning from one of those missions, and I was walking along a corridor in the basement of the Kremlin, and I heard a Germanic-sounding voice behind me and looked over my shoulder, and there was Dr. Kissinger. But he was busily talking to some high mugwump, and I had no personal exposure to him. The second time was in the spring of 1974, when I was the deputy head of the Soviet desk in the State Department. And I went to Moscow with Dr. Kissinger, not with him, not on his plane, to prepare for President Nixon's visit there in the summer of 1974. It was the time of that. And he was trying to restrict the size of the delegations that went with him. So his two principal advisors on the Soviet Union were Assistant Secretary Hartmann of the European Bureau and Hal Sonnenfeld, who was the counselor of the State Department. And both of them wanted to take their assistants along with them on the trip, but we couldn't get onto the plane, so they sent us ahead commercially. And Dr. Kissinger discovered that we were there in Moscow and thought that we had deliberately violated his effort to limit the size of his delegations. And we discovered that he had sent a back channel message to Washington demanding an immediate investigation as to why Roy and Blackwell, who was the assistant to Hal Sonnenfeld, were present in Moscow. So that was not a particularly auspicious occasion. My third exposure to him was when I hand-delivered to him the condolence message on the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. And I had the honor of handing him the cable, waiting while he read it, and then taking it away to dispatch it on its way. So that was my exposure in those early years. But the first, as I say, intellectual engagement with Dr. Kissinger occurred when I was ambassador in Beijing, and we would have long discussions then.
I have a follow-up, State, but I first want to go back to Wynne. You just told a story about Dr. Kissinger and airplanes, and Ambassador Lord, I know you're probably sick of telling this story, but most of our listeners probably haven't heard it, and it's such a great story, and I wonder if you could tell it one more time, including Dr. Kissinger's reaction.
Yeah, well, I'm not sick of telling it. I think the audiences are sick of hearing it, but I wanted to get back to you on this very question of temper and tantrums. When there was a real crisis, he was extremely calm, including with a sense of humor. So in the Middle East, Yom Kippur War breaking out, to quote current interests, he was editing a speech in the United Nations, and he kept phoning world leaders and sit down and go back editing the speech. When we flew secretly on Air Force 2 over to France for negotiations with the Vietnamese, he would sit in the plane and play chess with himself, white against black. When Joe and I rejected our draft of the Shanghai Communique in October '71, and we had 48 hours to try to fix it, he calmly instructed me how to rewrite it, went to bed until 4 a.m., got up, and then edited my version. So if the stakes were high and the pressure was great, he was fine. The problem is, if you filled his schedule up too much, or if you lost his laundry, he would erupt, like Vesuvius. And a good example is on the plane you mentioned. We were on this secret trip to China in July '71 on the Pakistani president's plane. And of course, we were all sitting there imagining the geopolitical earthquake that was coming, meeting Chinese leaders after 22 years of hostility. In my case, the fact my wife was Chinese from Shanghai, the James Bond secrecy aspect. But what was Henry worried about? His staff assistant had forgotten to pack any shirts, and he didn't want to look ridiculous. He borrowed one from my colleague, John Holder, who was much bigger, and so he went around looking like a penguin. And in fact, I told Henry, you hadn't even started negotiating with Joe and I yet. You've already lost your shirt. So he got off the plane in that shirt, and it had a label that said, "Made in Taiwan." Now, I took advantage of this chaos to get to your request, to sneak toward the front of the plane. Henry was still in the back, so that when we crossed into Chinese airspace, I got into China as the first American official in 22 years of head of Henry Kissinger. He had the good sportness to acknowledge this in his memoirs.
So, Stape, you mentioned that you really only started to have substantive conversations with him after 1991, when you became American ambassador in Beijing. At that point, he'd been out of power. for 14 years. It's the end of the Ford administration. How big a shadow did he cast at that time over, the State Department, the China Corps, China policy? Was he still in any way a presence, or did the principles and approaches that he'd laid down, were they still operative when you were out there in Beijing? Or was he at that point more a historical figure than a present force?
That's a good question, Robert. In a way, he was both. But he had, in 1991, he had no direct influence over U.S. policy. He and President Nixon carried out, I think, the most difficult phase of the breakthrough to China. It is incorrect to say that the United States did not understand the significance of the Sino-Soviet dispute, and that it caught us by surprise when there were military clashes in the spring of 1969. That is simply not accurate. The specialists in the State Department since the early 1960s had recognized that there was a serious dispute between China and the United States, between China and the Soviet Union. But beginning with President Kennedy, who wanted to find some way to turn the growing antagonism between Russia and China to the U.S. advantage, no one knew how to do it. And if you go back and read the intelligence summaries at the time, they all accurately depicted the existence of the quarrel between China and the Soviet Union. But nobody dreamed it was possible that an American president would offer to go to the capital of a hostile country while we had the relations with the other claimant to the legitimate representation of China internationally. So that was the surprising element. The second element is that there was a total lack of trust between the United States and China. And this is where, how do you convince Mao Zedong that the United States is serious in wanting to engage in a serious relationship with China? That is extraordinarily difficult. And in my judgment, most US administrations would have not known how to do it and would have flubbed it. But that is where the genius of Kissinger and President Nixon, I think on the first half of it, it was President Nixon who was willing to take the risk of going to China. But it took Dr. Kissinger to work out and gain the confidence of the Chinese that in making that offer, the United States was serious in seeking to engage with China. Wynn was involved in that aspect of it up to his ears. I was not involved at all. I was working in Moscow at the time. I got the benefit of the breakthrough in the opening because I was covering Far Eastern affairs in the Moscow embassy, and the Russians wouldn't let their Asia specialists talk to me until Dr. Kissinger showed up in Beijing, when all of a sudden they all wanted to talk to me. So that was the big difference. Dr. Kissinger was involved in trying to negotiate the conclusion of the Taiwan problem that was holding up full normalization into the Ford administration. But after Ford made the decision that he would not press ahead for normalization until after he got reelected in the 1976 election, and then he didn't get reelected. So at that point, the Republicans left office, President Carter came in, and he and National Security Advisor Brezhnev, Brzezinski, not Brezhnev, they were the key people working out the normalization arrangements. When Dr. Kissinger would show up when I was ambassador in Beijing, he would have meetings with Chinese leaders, but he was not really an influential figure in the State Department at the time on policy issues.
I wonder if we could go back to those first meetings with Chinese leaders, Ambassador Lord, that you were part of. There's long been a critique of Dr. Kissinger that he sort of got snookered, that he got played by Zhou Enlai, who wrapped his head in a cloud of flattery and faux philosophical conversations. This sort of critique, and yet Dr. Kissinger and Nixon really got exactly where they wanted to be, which belies, as does Dr. Kissinger's education and character more generally, that notion that he was somehow enamored of Zhou. I wonder, going back to those first meetings, what were the core goals and the principles that drove Dr. Kissinger throughout those long, complicated discussions, which did indeed veer off into some philosophical topics? But as I read it, he was highly directed the whole time. What was that direction? What were those principles?
Well, these are huge topics, and if I leave out part of your question, please come back to me. A quick comment on Stapleton, Nixon, and Kissinger was a terrific combination, as State implied, where Nixon had to make the tough political choices, but he had a strategic vision, unlike any other president that I've worked for, and I've worked with several of them. And he also had the sense to delegate just enough to Henry for negotiations and implementations without getting all much into the details, but being on top of it enough to know what was going on. And so that was required, particularly when Henry was over in China, without the communications you can have today and carrying out things, knowing enough about the president's backing and thinking that he could make these steps. Now, to get to your point, when we began to explore with China in the secret trip, we had two objectives. One was to make sure there was enough mutual interest to move ahead with could be a very volatile situation and could be a disaster if it failed. So we didn't want to set up a presidential visit unless we knew it was going to be productive. And indeed, in our secret exchanges through the Pakistanis setting up Henry's trip, we made it very clear that we wouldn't just talk about Taiwan, which is what the Chinese wanted, but we had to have a global agenda. But in this earlier period, all we had going with the Chinese was strategic talks. We didn't have any diplomatic relations, trade exchanges. It had to be essentially a conceptual relationship until we could flesh it out in coming years and decades. I was privileged to sit in on all the talks, not only with Zhou Enlai, but 5 times with Mao and Deng Xiaoping in the 70s. And Henry really was extraordinary in these talks. And he had to, with Zhou Enlai, not only had a soulmate who could talk history and philosophy and strategic goals, but that was the way to gain the confidence of the Chinese that we were each acting in our mutual interest. And the basic bargain that was struck in that secret trip and then the president's trip, and therefore the Shanghai communique, was we would postpone the Taiwan issue, which couldn't be resolved, while we worked on other issues, including balancing the Soviets in order to improve relations with the Soviets in our case, not to hem them in, as well as trying to achieve peace in Vietnam and stability in Asia and lift the morale of the American people and establish America's credibility, all of which we emerged with later successfully, even as the Chinese got their objectives of balancing the Soviets and coming out of the diplomatic isolation. So Henry's philosophic conceptual approach, of course, contained many specifics and concrete suggestions as well. So it was a very skillful blend. And I'd like to make one comment on what was needed to get going. Of course, the Chinese needed something on Taiwan for us to move ahead for the domestic purposes. Of course, it was very tough for Nixon and Kissinger. The canard, even today, is that Henry gave away Taiwan, or we made the major concessions, and the Chinese sort of swallowed us up. This is total nonsense. For 22 years in stale propaganda exchanges in Warsaw and Geneva and so on, the Chinese stuck to the position that we could not move ahead with relations unless we solved the Taiwan issue. And that was their initial position in our secret exchanges. What came out in the Shanghai communique in that visit? Yes, we agreed to an elastic, elusive, ambiguous one China policy, which maybe the three of us are the only people in the world understand, but that's the whole point of it. It served several administrations well. We could get along with China while Taiwan still had security and then democracy and economic strength. So in an exchange for the vague formulations, and of course it was a shock to Taiwan, I'm not downplaying that, But here's what the Chinese did. Having moved after 22 years of saying we had to solve this problem, or at least make major progress, what did they agree to in 72 when Nixon was there? We continue diplomatic relations with Taiwan. We continue the defense treaty with Taiwan. We continue to have troops in Taiwan. We said we might get rid of a few of them, but only if you help us solve the Vietnam issue. We'll take the troops related to Vietnam out of there. Henry reaffirmed the American defense commitment to Taiwan on Chinese soil. So the Chinese took great steps forward as well. And I would argue it was a fair bargain, but certainly not one where we gave away more than the Chinese.
So Kissinger and Nixon, they set this relationship in motion. But of course, they didn't know all the twists and turns that it would subsequently take. Dr. Kissinger remained for the 46 years after the Ford administration, up to really just a few weeks ago, when he appeared at a gala dinner that the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations ran. He remained active. He was in Beijing earlier this year. I wonder, Stape, if you could talk to us a little bit. I know this is a big topic, so feel free to take some time on how his views on China and his views on the relationship and how to manage it changed over the years through the period of engagement, Tiananmen, further engagement, especially commercial engagement, and now a souring of relations that, of course, he was very concerned about. And he saw toward the end of his life U.S.-China relations getting worse in an extremely complex international sphere. It's complex not only geostrategically, but because of the emergence of new technologies. Could you tell us how his views changed, if at all? What held constant, and how did he shift, if he shifted?
Dr. Kissinger is noted for his geostrategic view of international relations, particularly in the balance or absence thereof of the key power centers in the world. If you can't stabilize those relationships, then you can't have a stable international situation. His PhD thesis at Harvard, which was turned into a book, A World Restored, talked about how you reestablished a stable order in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, which had changed the power relationships. So both President Nixon and Henry Kissinger understood that the reason why we needed a breakthrough to our relationship with China was to strengthen our hand in the balance with the Soviet Union at that time, with the collateral purpose of trying to gain Chinese support for finding a solution to the Vietnam situation. They were successful in the first part. They were less successful in the second part, which was the getting real Chinese support in terms of Vietnam. Consistent with that worldview, Dr. Kissinger understood that China's rapid economic development, whose significance really only began to sink in at the beginning of the 21st century. In other words, the early period of China's rapid economic growth was sort of taking a rice-growing agricultural country and lifting it up to a lower middle-class status. But it was after 1995 that China began to build up its military budget and begin to emerge as a world power center. President Nixon, in his article in Foreign Affairs in 1967, had said, you can't have a stable international order if China is not somehow integrated into that order. And by China, he meant mainland China, the People's Republic of China. So clearly, as China's power increased, Dr. Kissinger's view of needing to address the destabilizing factors of a more powerful China and that didn't alter his view that you still needed China to be deeply engaged in trying to reestablish or preserve a stable international order. So I would say that he understood the significance of the shift in China's power relationship with respect to other countries, but it didn't alter his underlying view that a stable world order still required United States engagement with China in a way that would contribute to the stability that would benefit both countries. Wynn might want to offer something on that.
Sure. Well, Robert, that Stape, that was excellent. I have very little to add, but I want to pick up on the point that he just went to China a few months before dying, at the age of 100. By the way, here's a guy, he's 100 years old. He had one eye. He was partially deaf. He had a taxed heart. He was confined to a wheelchair because of a broken ankle. He had diabetes, and he had feral critics coming after him all the time. So what does he do at the age of 100 while he's running a business, counseling the administration and world leaders? He writes 2 books in his spare time, one of which was on artificial intelligence, which he set out to learn in his mid-90s. And then now he was writing another book on it when he passed away. My point here is that both the trip to China at the age of 100 and taking on artificial intelligence illustrate that he was genuinely concerned for what was coming for his children, his grandchildren, and future generations in total. In the case of China, he knew and saw, and that's why he worked on it to the very end, that the U.S.-China relationship was going to be the most significant relationship probably for decades to come in this world and for future generations. And artificial intelligence, he knew, was going to redraw the whole map of human existence with both its possibilities and its perils. So I just like to point out, with all the critics coming after him now in the wake of his leaving us, I'd like to point out some of these qualities of him that are going to be overlooked. In terms of his dealing with China, I can't add much to what Stape said. Obviously, the early going had to be mostly one of strategic and balance of power in a bilateral sense versus the rest of the world. But as they grew in power, how you fit them into the multilateral system, how you balance off against other interests, and how we could flesh out bilateral exchanges assumed greater importance. So that's really sort of echoing what Stape said.
That's a great segue to the next question, which is perhaps one of the central questions about Dr. Kissinger's career and his character. And this question comes from Sam Wells, who was the former deputy director at the Wilson Center. We ended up pooling the entire Wilson Center community, including its many scholars, with questions for the two of you. And Sam has asked a question. We had many versions of this same question, but I'm going to use his. He asks, Richard Haass described Henry Kissinger's decision-making on complex issues as prioritizing order over justice. Is this a useful way to evaluate Kissinger's legacy? And this gets to the question of morality and national interests. I know that you've both dealt with this question for many years. It does seem that in his later years, Dr. Kissinger became more comfortable and really very frank in speaking about the importance of American values to American foreign policy. But how do you see this question? Did he prioritize order over justice? How did he reconcile damage, harm to individuals with pursuit of national interests? And maybe if we go Stape, or go with Wynn and then Stape on this one.
Well, that's obviously a very complex and seminal question in evaluating Henry, but I would argue, and I think Stape would agree, in diplomacy, it's the toughest challenge you have intellectually and in terms of policy. It's another way of saying interests and values in many ways. The quick answer to the question is that I think it's a phony question. I mean, with all due respect, I understand what they're getting at. I don't mean to accuse the going to put it, but you cannot choose, in Henry's view, between order and justice. That he felt for human rights to be ultimately protected, you had to have a degree of order, of stability in the world system and even within governments. And so, yes, he acquired a reputation. And again, I want to commend the question. I didn't mean phony in the sense of asking it, but just in my view, intellectually, you can't separate out. I helped to write a speech on this entire subject that Henry gave in Minneapolis in 1975, so everybody can go read it. But that made the point that you've got to have, and he's written about this extensively, you've got to have some vision of where you're going and what you stand for, but you also have to have a great degree of realism in geopolitics. I can't do this issue justice at the time, but in my view, maybe partly affected by his youth in Germany and what happens when you have authoritarian leaders and how you deal with it, maybe for other reasons. He wrote at great length to say that if you don't have order and stability, you're going to have a breakdown in other ways. And on the human rights question, I'll be frank, he and I would have debates on this. We both recognize that you had to have both the human rights development issue in your foreign policy, but you also had to take account of geopolitical and security interests. And in dealing with China and elsewhere, sometimes I would find a slightly higher balance to the human rights than he would, but always within the bounds of mutual respect. And he often gets a bum rap on this issue, in my opinion. We don't have time to go into it, but some of the critiques coming out now, whether it's on Vietnam or Cambodia and some other issues, really are unfair, in my opinion. We don't have time to do them justice.
Stape.
I think Gwen has summarized it very nicely. I think basically Dr. Kissinger's view would be that you can't have justice without order. Look at the Gaza Strip. I mean, you have human rights violations there on an enormous level, and you can't address the problem if you can't reestablish some sort of order within which to deal with it. Conceptually, and I'm putting thoughts into Dr. Kissinger's mind, since he can't contradict me now, I would say his prioritization is that in formulating policies, you have to do what needs to be done to advance the national interest. But he increasingly realized, and this is reflected, I've mentioned earlier his book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? He devotes a chapter to the question of human rights. And he realized, which I think he did not realize early in the Nixon administration, that you cannot maintain or gain support for a foreign policy which is geopolitically right if you don't keep domestic support for the policy. And to get and keep domestic support, you have to also address the values side versus the interest side of American attitudes.
But that sounds like an instrumentalist approach to values. You need to address values to get support for policy. What about the values and the moral considerations as such, sort of in the first instance for Kissinger?
Well, one can get into an endless argument on that question. I would argue that the moralists do not have a good record in terms of being able to establish the order that advances the cause of human rights. I think you do a better job if you get the prioritization right. This is where you can have your fundamental debate, because for some people, you need to pursue the human rights. I'll give you an example. President Clinton created a link. Wynn is intimately familiar with this. President Clinton created a linkage between human rights and our most favored nation treatment of Chinese trade. And he broke it after a year. And the Chinese said that they were prepared to cooperate with us on human rights issues as long as we didn't sponsor a resolution at the Human Rights Conference in Geneva criticizing China's human rights practices. The United States knew that we did not have the votes to pass that resolution. But for domestic political reasons, the decision was made to go ahead and sponsor the resolution, even though China then refused to cooperate with us on human rights issues. Now that gets at the practical question of, are you better off promoting human rights in China when you can't get Chinese cooperation? Or are you better off working with them to try to get the incremental improvements that outside countries are capable of getting, if any progress at all, in terms of how human rights issues are addressed? But Wynn was at the Washington side of that, so he would be familiar with that. My view is that it would have been more sensible. It was the same reason I thought that Jiang Zemin should have been given a visit to the United States in 1994. And the reason was, if Jiang Zemin was coming to the United States, he would want to have as favorable a reception as possible. And that would give us leverage on human rights issues in order to improve the climate for his visit. I think that we could have actually gotten away with the Li Denghui visit to the United States in 1995 that resulted in a crisis if we had permitted Jiang Zemin to get an official reception when he came to the United States before Li Denghui came on an unofficial visit, because the contrast would have given us that extra leverage that we needed. But we did it the opposite way, and that undermined our influence with the Chinese. So these are examples of the types of trade-offs you have to make, and there's no easy solution to that. I did not fly into a rage when the administration handled it the way it did, because I saw the reasoning behind the way that they handled it, but I thought the alternative way would have handled it better.
Robert, let me add to, if I could, on this basic, because it really is crucial. And it's a fair debate on this issue. But as Stape said, some of the critics, they're taking a pure approach. And if you work in government and to deal with these issues, you've often got to choose between the lesser of two evils. You've got to balance off. The perfect can't be the enemy of the good. And to just go back to the Cold War, several American presidents had to hold their nose and deal with unsavory characters in order to balance the Soviet Union and defend off the danger of nuclear war. The ultimate human right is to live, and if you have nuclear war, you can't live. So tough choices were made on who he had to work with for tactical reasons, and many people forget that. And almost all presidents had to do that, as well as Henry. The other point I make, State mentioned a very important point about Henry's attitude on foreign policy: incremental. He generally felt, whether it's the Middle East then or the Middle East today, or other examples, that you can't leap forward to a final solution in most cases. You've got to build up mutual trust and momentum on both sides with incremental steps. And so those who wanted to take great leaps forward, whether it's on human rights or other things, I don't think understand the intricacies and the need for a step-by-step approach, or the balancing of values and interests, and then, for that matter, the molding of values and interests in many ways that a diplomat has to exercise, and Henry had to do in a very complex world. Let's remember what Nixon and Kissinger inherited in 1969. We had at home a president who just resigned, a series of assassinations, riots in the street, and a long war, and a bloody war, and an expensive war that we were bogged down in. Overseas, we had no contact with 1/4 of the world's people. We had a difficult, nervous relationship with the Soviet Union. We had this ongoing war, which after all, the predecessors left Henry and Nixon with, and we were losing influence to the Russians in the Middle East and elsewhere. All four of those key overseas problems, as well as our domestic situation, were handled by Nixon and Kissinger. So in order to pull this off, and not only took the skills that State was talking about earlier, of balancing a conceptual approach, it took incredible courage and hard work, and it obviously invites second guessing and criticism, some of which is fair for debate.
To finish off part of Stape's story, in the event Jiang Zemin didn't come to the United States until 1997, much later, This worked out very well for me because I was invited to interpret for Dr. Kissinger when he hosted Jiang Zemin for his big policy speech, and that was the first time that I got to meet Kissinger. A much more, a narrower but very interesting question from Don Wolfensberger, who's the Congress scholar here at the Wilson Center. How was Kissinger perceived by Congress, when he was in office, and how did he regard the Hill? How did he see them? How did they see him?
I think that's one for Win because he was working with Dr. Kissinger at that time.
Yeah, well, he thought they were very important. Of course, he was frustrated increasingly by the restrictions of Congress, which was reacting to executive overreach in many people's views, and of course, particularly on whether we could support South Vietnam after the peace agreement was accorded. And he always felt that that might have held up if Congress hadn't cut off the president and aid to Saigon. But as a general proposition, he knew the importance of Congress. He worked very closely and quietly behind the scenes with members of both parties. And he laments, as we all do, the fact that in those days, people could reach across the aisle and work together, which is almost impossible today. So he paid assiduous attention to this front. There's no question, given his desire to get things done in presidential power, that he often felt frustrated by congressional restrictions, whether it was Jackson Vanik on dealing with the Soviets or other issues. But he recognized the constitutional and democratic right of Congress to be involved, and he worked very hard at it.
We have a question, another question that you may or may not have had these discussions with Dr. Kissinger, but I think it's worth asking. It comes from Michael Kugelman, who's the director of the South Asia Institute at Wilson. He says, Kissinger's efforts to normalize ties with Beijing produced several policy decisions that alienated New Delhi and paved the way for rocky U.S.-India relations during the last decades of the Cold War. In more recent years, how did Kissinger view India's rise and its competition with China? Did Kissinger believe, as many in Washington do, that India is an important partner to enlist in efforts to counter China? Again, I realize this may not be a discussion that you had with him, but in case you did, I thought it was a good thing to put on the table.
Well, I'll take a quick crack and see if you want to add. I think I have talked to Henry about this, not at great length, but his view would be that if you want India's help, you have to treat it as a goal in itself to have good relations, not just as a weapon against China or anyone else. First of all, that's the wrong way to approach it, and it'll turn the Indians off. They don't want to have to choose. So I think he would approve, which I think is our present posture, of trying to work with India in the Indo-China-Pacific framework, and we've expanded Pacific framework to Indo-China framework for those reasons, because of New Delhi's rise. But I'm quite sure he would say, when working with the Indians, don't pitch it as an anti-Chinese. They'll get the point anyway. They're concerned about the Chinese on their border, and it's in their interest to work with us to protect their security. But they have other economic and other interests with China. And so they don't want to just be seen as a pawn in our competition with China. So I think we would have this grounded, sophisticated approach. But I turn it over to Steve.
I've had the same discussion with Dr. Kissinger. And a lot of the controversial issues that he's criticized in the media, I've discussed with him, including some of the incidents that I've had with him. We would joke about the fact that he was sending angry messages about my presence in Moscow and things like that. I think that I was in Moscow at the time, and from our Moscow perspective as American diplomats, we thought the tilt toward Pakistan and against India at the time of the separation of Bangladesh from West Pakistan was mishandled. We thought that we were leaning too far in the direction of Pakistan. But as Dr. Kissinger justifies it, Pakistan had given us unprecedented support in bringing off the China breakthrough initiative. And under those circumstances, and the equities in the separation of Bangladesh from West Pakistan are not as simple as they are sometimes presented. It wasn't just the freedom struggle. There was a role by India in stimulating the separation. There were other factors that a foreign policy practitioner would have to take into account. But I think there's no question that there was a deliberate tilt toward Pakistan because of the assistance they had given us. And that's how you conduct diplomacy. There are trade-offs, and I think Wynn has been very, because I know how strongly he feels about human rights and other issues of that sort. But we don't live in a simple world where you can simply put one issue ahead of the practicalities of trying to carry things out. I would point to the fact that Woodrow Wilson came up with an idealistic approach to the peace settlement after World War I and the concept of the League of Nations. And it turned out he couldn't get domestic support for that approach. And as a result, we were not a member of the League of Nations and didn't play as strong a hand as we could have played in the interwar period in trying to have dealt with the rise of Nazism in Germany. We were more interested in getting our debts repaid than we were in stabilizing a balance in Europe, which had been destabilized by the results of World War I. So the idealistic approach, in my experience, does not produce good foreign policy. But it has to be an important element in foreign policy because you do have to have the domestic support to carry out a good foreign policy. Otherwise, you're dead in the water.
A quick comment again, Robert. I didn't work directly on the Bangladesh issue at the time, but as Steve has indicated, it wasn't just supporting Pakistan because of their help opening to China. There were clear intelligence reports that Nixon and Kissinger were about that India was thinking of moving on West Pakistan as well as what was happening in East Pakistan. So there was that element. Having said all that, I do feel, and I expressed it somewhat at the time, but I wasn't directly involved except the China angle, that Nixon and Kissinger could have been a little tougher on New Delhi with respect to, on Pakistan with respect to the Bangladesh issue. I think they could have been more critical in that, but on balance, I agree with Stape's analysis. So this is a perfect example of the trade-offs you have to make. I think in this case, as I said, I think it could have been shaded a bit more, but they had reasons beyond just the opening to China to support the Pakistan.
We have a question from Anders Beal, who's the senior associate in our Latin America program. And this one might be a little bit tricky. It's going to require you to be speculative about what Dr. Kissinger might think. But as Stape said, he can't tell you that you're wrong. And I think this is an important angle, so we should ask the question. Anders writes, a young progressive wing of the Democratic Party has sought to merge domestic and international policy frameworks in support of U.S. values, namely democracy, and they are trying to address anti-democratic forces in the United States as well as anti-democratic forces abroad. An example is a recent CODEL led by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, who engaged with leftist leaders in Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. They were focusing not on things like the prospect of a new Cold War with China, but on how to protect democracy, strengthen alliances, understand the complex causes of migration. This attempt from the younger progressive congresspeople to merge domestic and international values promotion or values diplomacy. I guess the question is, what do you think that Kissinger would think of that? Or would he warn against that? Or would he see that as a potentially valuable avenue, really leading with values at home and abroad?
Well, I suspect he would be somewhat suspicious of it. I think he would understand and respect the motives, but I'm not sure he would agree with the practicalities. I'll let Stape take it on further, but a quick point on this whole question. I'm schizophrenic in many ways because I'm a strong believer in Henry's approach of geopolitics, balance of power, realpolitik, etc. But my wife was Eleanor Roosevelt's, my mother was Eleanor Roosevelt's successor as ambassador to the UN for Human Rights. I was chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy, and my wife got a Human Rights Award from President Clinton in the White House. So I grapple with these issues all the time, even as I defend Kissinger and have generally agreed with him. But I leave to Staple if you'd like to speculate. I suspect he'd be somewhat suspicious of this approach, but as I said, would respect the motives.
I agree with Wynn's assessment. I've wrestled a lot because I've had to deal with human rights issues in China as ambassador, and I had to do the same thing in Indonesia. And my experience and my understanding of history is you always have some tension between your interests and your values. In the final analysis, countries tend to act in terms of their interests and to justify their actions in terms of their values, even when it's not a good fit. So therefore, foreign policy should seek to narrow the contradiction between your interests and your values, because policies based on interests that are also consistent with your values are the most stable policies in terms of being able to deal with the real world. But that no country is capable of surviving if it puts its values ahead of its interests in dealing with the real types of problems that emerge in the world. And people joke about China and say that it's a perfect example, that it runs China in terms of the legalist philosophy, and it justifies it in terms of its Confucian ideals, which is an example. I've talked to some Confucianists who reject that idea, but to me, it's a helpful way to understand how other countries square the circle between interests and values. To me, it's a common feature of international relations that people act in terms of their interests and justify it in terms of their values. I think a values-based foreign policy, by and large, is going to run into insuperable problems in dealing with the real world.
So I said that, please.
This is a core issue, and we spent a lot of time on it, so I won't extend. I do, in fact, recommend Henry's 1975 speech, which helped to cause me a lot of blood and anguish putting it together as well. It's the most sophisticated approach of his thinking on this issue, but it's a crucial issue.
So I said we wanted to have a sort of a light, personal discussion about Henry Kissinger, and then I've asked you all these weighty, more or less impossible questions. I've asked you to do a lot of heavy lifting. In the few minutes we have left, a good question from Michael Waller, who's a member of our Global Affairs Council, which is simply, which of Kissinger's books would you recommend that people read if they want to know the essence of his thinking? If we could just end with each of you with a book recommendation.
Well, one of Henry's book critics said his long books, once you put them down, you can't pick them up. So a lot of his best books are long. In all seriousness, I would still recommend his memoirs, because it gives you, that's only 3,500 pages by the time you get through it, but it gives you not only the macro approach and strategic thinking of Henry, but it gives you the granular details to illustrate them. But one last point on humor, because one way I could survive and the staff could survive working with Henry was the humor that he had and we had. So, and this included his willingness to be jested at. I often compared him to his face to Chairman Mao. I said they both developed a cult of personality. They both assigned their closest staff members to hard labor. And they both produced little red books.
Wendy, You mentioned humor. Do you know if he ever heard the Monty Python song, Henry Kissinger, and if so, what he thought of it?
That I do not know, but he had a fabulous sense of humor. That and our common love of sports were the two things that kept us together in times of stress.
Stape, do you have a book recommendation?
It brings, listening to Win, it brings to mind the Dorothy Parker quote, his sins were as scarlet, but his books were red. There's no single book. I would recommend reading A World Restored, reading Does America Need a Foreign Policy? Because I think his chapter on human rights there is probably an extension of the speech that Wynne worked on in 1975. But it shows how he understood the importance of human rights in maintaining the support you need for a foreign policy. And he articulates it, I thought, very skillfully. I think the last three chapters of his book on China is worth reading. And I think both his books on diplomacy and on world order give very useful insights into how he understands foreign policy should be conducted.
Thank you. I think we should try to work a Dorothy Parker quote into every Wilson Center program. But Ambassador Winston Lord, Ambassador Stapleton Roy, thank you so much for joining us on very short notice for what I thought was a terrific conversation. I hope that our listeners enjoyed it. If you did, you can have your friends watch it over the weekend on YouTube. It should be posted up there soon. Again, thank you so very much for helping us to understand Dr. Henry Kissinger.
Thank you.
Thank you.